Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the quantitative results chapter. And just before we begin the presentation, I'd like to give you this information in case you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do provide help with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you do need more one-on-one help outside of this webinar, you can use the information here to contact us and learn more about the different services that we provide. And first, I'm just going to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So today's webinar is on the quantitative results chapter. So today we will only be covering quantitative results. We will not be talking about qualitative results. And first, we'll talk about the purpose and importance of the results chapter to the dissertation. And then we'll go through all of the typical components of the results chapter, from the introduction to the data collection and preparation, demographics, assumptions testing, hypothesis testing, and the summary. And then after we go through all the components, we'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. So if you do have questions, you can feel free to type those into the questions section. And once we get to the end of the presentation, any questions that were not answered during the course of the presentation, we will answer those at the end. So first, let's talk about what the purpose of the results chapter is to the dissertation. So the purpose of the results chapter is to present the data and the analyses that you conducted to answer your research questions or hypotheses. So by the end of the results chapter, you should have clear answers to each of your research questions and hypotheses. That is the purpose of the chapter. It's to get answers to each of those questions. And so in the results chapter, you want to present the findings for each of the research questions or hypotheses with a clear statement that answers each research question and hypothesis. So at the end of the results chapter, specifically if you're writing your hypotheses in null and alternative format, you should have a clear statement that says for each hypothesis, whether that hypothesis was rejected or not rejected, if you're talking about the null hypothesis, or whether each hypothesis was supported or not supported. And you don't want to go into much more interpretation beyond answering those research questions and hypotheses. You want to save further interpretation, meaning relating the results back to the literature or talking about implications. You want to save that for your discussion chapter. So typically you don't go into deeper interpretation than just presenting the answers to the research questions and hypotheses. And while we will be discussing the sections that are typical to present in the results chapter based on our experience with many different schools, you do want to make sure that you check your specific school or degree program's guidelines for the results chapter. So there may be different sections that your school requires. Your school may require the sections in a different order. They may require slightly different content for each section. It can vary depending on the school and degree program that you are in. So you always want to make sure that you follow the specific guidelines that are required for your program. So now let's talk about the different components of the chapter. And usually, like most of the other chapters, the chapter just starts with a brief introduction where you reorient the reader to the purpose of the study and the research questions. So you just want to briefly restate the problem or the purpose statement. You want to restate your research questions and hypotheses. And again, the research questions and hypotheses should be presented verbatim. based on how they appear in your previous sections. So the research questions and hypotheses should be worded exactly the same way throughout your document. And then you just want to go over the contents of the results chapter. And this can be as simple as just listing the different section headings that will appear in the results chapter. And after the introduction, typically the first thing that you talk about is the data collection and preparation of the data for the analysis. So you'll want to summarize your data collection procedures that you conducted, and importantly, note any changes from the originally proposed data collection procedures that you had in your proposal or your methodology chapter. This is important because you may propose certain procedures in your methodology, but when you actually get to your data collection, it's possible that some of those procedures could change. Things can come up in your study that require you to change how you do your data collection. You might have to do something differently from how you originally proposed it in your proposal phase of your dissertation. And so if any of those procedures were different, if you did have to do anything differently from what you originally proposed, you want to make those changes or differences clear in your results chapter. And there are different approaches for how schools may want you to do this. Some schools may want you to actually go back to your methodology chapter and change it to reflect the procedures that you actually conducted. But other schools may want you to keep your methodology chapter the same and then just note differences in the procedures once you get to your results chapter. So again, that's a thing where you may want to defer to your school's guidelines and your committee's recommendations for how you deal with any changes in your data collection procedures. And once you summarize the data collection procedures, you want to talk about your response rate and any attrition that you saw in the data. So attrition just refers to participants dropping out or reasons why you might exclude certain participants or certain responses. And so you want to talk about how many total responses did you receive. So for instance, if you're doing a simple online survey study, you'll want to talk about how many total responses were submitted to your survey. You want to talk about if you had to remove or exclude any responses. So maybe you had specific inclusion criteria for your study, and maybe some of the responses didn't meet that inclusion criteria. Maybe you had to remove some responses because they gave you incomplete data, or maybe you identified some responses where participants weren't taking the survey seriously, or they were giving inaccurate responses. So you want to discuss any possible reasons why you may have excluded any participants or responses, and if so, how many did you exclude? Then you want to state what your final total sample size is after you exclude any of those responses. And then some schools may also want you to conduct a post hoc power analysis if your target sample size wasn't met. So usually in your proposal phase, you would do a power analysis to determine the sample size that you need for the statistical analysis. But it may not always be the case that you're able to reach that target sample size. You may get to your data collection phase and find that you're not able to get the number of participants that you were aiming for based on your power analysis. So if this is the case, then you may need to conduct a post hoc power analysis to determine the statistical power of your study if your sample size fell short of that target number. And then you also want to discuss preliminary data preparation steps. So this can involve checking the data for accuracy, talking about missing data and checking for outliers, as well as coding the data and computing scores for variables. So checking the data for accuracy is especially important if you're doing a study that involves manual data entry, So if you were doing, for instance, an in-person survey where people served out or filled out the survey on paper and pencil, and then you had to manually enter the data into an electronic format, then you want to make sure that you double check that data to make sure you entered the data correctly, that there weren't any mistakes in the data entry, and all the responses fall within the possible range of values that they can take on. You'll want to discuss any missing data that's in your data set or missing responses, and how you're going to handle that missing data. So are you just going to exclude any participants who are missing any data at all? Are you going to keep participants who are missing some responses? And if so, how are you going to handle those missing responses? Are you going to try to impute or replace those responses in some way? Or are you going to handle the missing data using some other method? And you may also at this stage want to describe how you're checking the data for potential outliers. And if you find outliers, how are you going to handle those outliers? Are you just going to remove those values, or are you going to modify those values in some way? Or are you going to just keep the outliers as they are? And then the coding of the data can involve, especially if you're doing a survey study, how are you coding each of the instruments? Do you need to recode any of the values of the variables? For instance, does an instrument have any items that need to be reverse coded? And then how are you computing the scores for the actual variables that you're using for your analysis? So if you're, for instance, using some kind of survey measure of self-esteem that has 10 items, how are you computing the overall self-esteem score for that instrument? Are you taking an average of the items, or are you calculating a score in some other way? You'll want to describe all of those data preparation steps in this section. And so here are just a couple of examples of excerpts of write-ups that describe the data collection and preliminary handling of the data. So you see here in this example, we say that we had a total, our initial total of responses. How many responses did we get? We discuss, if we're excluding participants who were missing large portions of data. And then we talk about what we're doing with any other missing responses that we're including in the final data set. And then here's another example that's a little more detailed. It explains more about the data collection procedures. Again, tells us, how many total responses that we got at the beginning of the survey. We discuss, how many participants were excluded, and the reason for excluding those participants. So, some of them didn't agree to the informed consent. Some of them were missing data. Some of them didn't meet our inclusion criteria. And then we talk about the final total sample size that we achieved. And then here's just a short excerpt that describes how you might write up a post-hoc power analysis in case you did not meet your target sample size. So we say we had to conduct a post-hoc power analysis. We state what statistical analysis we're basing our power analysis on. So in this case, a t-test and a regression. And then we say what our achieved power was for each of those analyses based on the sample size that we obtained. So once you've described all the preliminary data preparation steps in your data collection, then you'll want to talk about demographics and basic descriptive statistics. So you'll want to present descriptive statistics for all of your demographic variables and the variables of interest, meaning all of the variables that are involved with your research questions. So you typically report frequencies and percentages for any categorical variables. So this can include things like gender or ethnicity. And then means and standard deviations are typical for continuous variables such as age and years, grade point average, or any other continuous numerical variables. If possible, you may want to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to your population of interest. So if you do have information from the larger population in terms of, what's the breakdown of males versus females in this population? What's the breakdown of ethnicity in the population? What's the age range in this population? If you have that information, you can compare um, the descriptive statistics for those demographics for your study to the population to give your reader a sense of how representative your sample is to that population. And then if you have any instruments where inter-item reliability is applicable, you may want to present reliability coefficients or Cronbach's alphas for those measures. And here are just some examples of how you might present the descriptive statistics. So here we have just a short excerpt describing the demographic characteristics. So we talk a little bit about the variables in this narrative, and then we also have a table breaking down the frequencies and the percentages for each of these demographic characteristics. And it's important to note that when you have a table like this, you want to make sure of a few things. So first of all, you want to make sure that each table that you put in your results chapter is referenced somewhere in the narrative. So we see in the narrative, we say the demographic characteristics are displayed in table 1. So you want to have a reference to the table specifically in the text. You don't want to just present a table and not have any reference to it in the narrative. And also you want the table to come or appear very shortly after where you refer to it in the text. Usually it should appear directly below the paragraph where you reference it in the text. But for instance, you don't want to say, these statistics are presented in table 1, and then table 1 doesn't appear until 5 pages later. You want that table to appear shortly after you reference it in the text. And then here's just an example of a table for continuous variables. So the previous example showed a table for categorical variables, and here are some continuous variables where we show the mean and the standard deviation, as well as the minimum and maximum values. And then here's an example of how you might present information for reliability coefficients. So here's a table showing Cronbach's alpha coefficients, as well as a narrative to describe the Cronbach's alphas. So after you have done all of your descriptive statistics, then you start getting into the analysis to answer each of your research questions. But typically for those analyses, you'll have certain statistical assumptions that you need to test. So first, you may need to discuss any assumption testing that is required for the analyses that you have chosen. And so for the assumptions testing, you will want to list and discuss the required assumptions tests for each analysis that you're conducting. So for instance, if you're doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA or a regression, there will be certain assumptions tests that you need to check for each of those analyses. And then for each assumption that you're testing, you want to describe how each assumption was tested. So for instance, if you're testing the assumption of normality, you want to say how you're testing normality. So are you testing it by doing a Shapiro-Wilk test? Are you testing it by looking at histograms or skewness and kurtosis values? Or maybe you're using a QQ plot. You want to state exactly how you are testing that assumption. you want to state what the result of that assumptions test is. So you don't just want to say that you're testing normality. You want to say what the result of that normality test was. You should be able to say, was the assumption met or was the assumption not met? And then if the assumption was not met based on the results of your test, what action are you going to take to address the fact that that assumption was not met? So if normality wasn't met, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to run an alternative test, like a non-parametric test that does not require normality to be met? Or are you going to try to transform the data so that it meets the assumption of normality? You'll want to describe what action you are taking to address that assumption. And it's worth noting that there are different ways that you can present the assumptions testing. Sometimes you can present the assumptions testing in its own dedicated section before you go into the discussion of your analyses. Or sometimes the assumptions testing is just presented alongside each analysis. So you might, for each analysis that you do, you might start with the assumptions, then present the results of that analysis, then go on to your next research question, present the assumptions for those, and then the analysis for those, and follow that format. Again, you'll want to check your school's specific guidelines for how exactly they want you to organize that information. So let's look at some examples of how you might describe your assumption testing. So here's an example of a test for normality with a normal PP plot. So we say in our narrative how we're testing normality. We make an interpretation of this plot saying that the data did not appear to deviate from normal, and we say that the assumption was met. And then here's an example where we describe some assumptions, and it's a case where one of our assumptions was not met. So we describe multicollinearity and we describe outliers. And we see here that we did observe an outlier in the data. And then we give a brief statement saying how we are dealing with that outlier. We are just saying that we excluded that observation from the analysis. So we say how we're testing for each assumption, and then we address how the assumption was addressed if the assumption was not met. And then after you have addressed all of your assumptions testing, then you can get into your analysis of the research questions. So this is really the main part of the results chapter where you discuss the analyses that you're conducting to address each research question or hypothesis. And you'll want to organize this section by research question or hypothesis. So for instance, if you have 5 research questions, you just want to go in order of the research questions 1 through 5. You don't really want to jump around in the chapter, like start with research question 2, then jump to research question 4, then go back to research question 1. You want this section to be organized in a logical order, and that usually involves following the order in which you've presented your research questions throughout your paper. And just like the data collection procedures, you want to note any changes from the originally proposed data analysis procedures back in your methodology. So in your methodology chapter, you would have proposed a certain data analysis plan for answering your research questions. But it may be the case that over the course of your data collection, you had to make some kind of change and conduct a different analysis, because maybe you weren't able to collect the data that you originally intended to collect, or maybe you didn't get a high enough sample size to conduct the analysis that you originally planned to. Whatever the case may be, if you had to change anything from what you originally proposed for your data analysis, you want to note those changes in this chapter. And for each analysis, you want to clearly identify the variables that you're using in each analysis. So if you're doing something like a t-test, you want to clearly identify your independent and dependent variables. So say you're conducting an independent samples t-test, your independent variable is this, your dependent variable is that. If you're doing something like a regression, you want to clearly state what your predictor or criterion or covariate variables are. And you want to report the appropriate statistics associated with each test. So this usually involves at least p-values, which allow you to actually answer your research questions, determine if your results are statistically significant. You may also want to report effect sizes or confidence intervals. And then, if applicable, you want to report the results of any post hoc testing. So you may do some kind of an analysis like an ANOVA, where you get an overall result for your ANOVA, and if that is significant, then you do post hoc tests to determine more information about the nature of that result. So if you do have an analysis that requires post hoc testing, that you want to report the results of that post hoc test as well as any relevant statistics associated with it. And then very importantly, you want to make sure you have a clear statement that answers each research question or hypothesis based on the results of your analysis. So for each research question or hypothesis, you just want to have a clear statement saying, was the hypothesis rejected or not rejected, if you're talking about a null hypothesis. If you have more general hypotheses, you could state, was your hypothesis supported or not supported? Or what was the answer to your research question? If your research question is, is there a relationship between these two variables? You want to make sure that you can answer that question with a yes or a no based on the results of the analysis that you conducted. So let's look at a couple of examples of how you might write up the results for some different analyses. So this is an example of a simple t-test, and it's an example of a t-test where the results do not turn out to be significant. But here you can see that we state what analysis we're conducting. We identify our independent variable and our dependent variable. We present the results of our t-test. So we present our t-statistic along with the degrees of freedom. In parentheses, we have our t-statistic here. We have our p-value, and we have our Cohen's d, which is our measure of effect size. So we have all of our relevant statistics associated with the t-test as well as an effect size measure. And then we give an interpretation of that t-test result saying that it's not significant, there's no differences in the scores. And then importantly, we have this clear statement for our hypothesis. Our null hypothesis was not rejected. And then we just have a table showing descriptive statistics associated with that t-test. And now here's an example of a t-test that does turn out to be significant. So again, we say what test we're doing, we state our independent and dependent variables, we give the relevant statistics for our t-test here. This time it is significant because our p-value is less than 0.05, indicates that there are differences in the scores. And then we make our statement about our hypothesis here. Our null hypothesis was rejected. And now here's a similar example with a one-way analysis of variance. Again, we state what test we're doing. We state our independent and dependent variables. We give the relevant statistics for the ANOVA. So we present our F statistic along with its degrees of freedom. And for any kind of F test, whether it's an ANOVA or some other analysis that uses the F statistic, you want to make sure you present both of the degrees of freedom. So there's always a numerator degrees of freedom and then a denominator degrees of freedom for an F statistic. So you want to make sure you present both of those. And of course, our p-value for that test, in this case, it's not significant, indicating that there are no differences. and we give our statement for our hypothesis that our null hypothesis was not rejected. Now, here's an example of results for a correlation. So in this case, we actually restate our research question. We say that we're conducting a Pearson correlation, and we state what variables that we're using in that Pearson correlation. We give the appropriate statistics for the correlation. So our correlation coefficient R and the p-value for each correlation coefficient. And we see that we have significant correlations here. We say that the variables are positively correlated. And we make a statement about our hypothesis. Our null hypothesis was rejected. And now here's an example of results for a multiple linear regression. So again, we have results for our regression. In this case, it's an F test. We have our F statistic, our p-value, our R squared value, which indicates the amount of variance explained. Since our regression is significant, we reject our null hypothesis. And then for a regression, we usually present a table showing the results for all the individual regression coefficients. And we might have some narrative explaining the regression coefficients if any of those are significant. In this case, we have a regression coefficient that is significant. So we interpret that regression coefficient, say it's a positive predictor, and give a short statement about what that means. And so after you have gone through all of your research questions and hypotheses, described all the analysis for those, you have arrived at an answer for each of your research questions and hypotheses, you can end your chapter with a summary. And again, depending on what your school wants in the summary can summarize all of the chapter contents or just giving a summary of the findings for each of the research questions and hypotheses. You'll want to restate the answer to each research question and hypothesis. So for each hypothesis, again, give the statement for if the null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected, or if the hypothesis was supported or not supported. And then you usually end by just giving a transitioning statement to your discussion chapter. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation, covering all of the components of the quantitative results chapter. Again, you can use the information that you see here to contact us in case you are interested in additional support outside of these webinars. And so now that we've gone through the presentation, I'll now go through and answer any specific questions that you might have. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to type those into the question section now. And I'll just check here and see if we have any questions so far. I have one question that asks, if we don't have population information, should we compare our sample to the closest thing to population information? For example, large scale national studies. Yes, I think you can absolutely do that. And sometimes it may not be necessary to try to compare to the population if just none of that information is available. If you can find something close, then you can absolutely do that. And usually you would get estimates for demographic breakdowns in the population based on what you just said, like a large scale national study. You may also compare what you found to a similar study in your field. So if especially if you're basing your study off of a specific study in the literature or a set of studies that are out there, you might look at the demographics from their studies and see, okay, what were the demographic breakdowns when they did their study? Is mine similar? Is mine different? That could be another option for you as well. But really, kind of the purpose of that is to just give your reader a sense of how representative your sample is to the population that you are trying to investigate or generalize to. So any information that you can provide about that gives the reader a better sense of that is going to be a strength to your results. Let's see the other questions. Any specific additional sections to add to results for a secondary analysis? I wouldn't necessarily say there are different sections that you would need for a secondary analysis, and your data collection procedures section may look a little bit different, because if you're doing analysis of secondary data, obviously your data collection procedures are going to be different from if you're collecting primary data. So you may just want to reiterate, the process that you went through to obtain that secondary data. Anything that you had to deal with in the process, any issues that came up dealing with the data, any issues that came up with, maybe the data were different from what you had originally expected in your proposal phase, or maybe even if you had to find a completely different data source from what you originally proposed. So, maybe originally you were planning to do a study based on data from the National Institute of Health, but maybe you weren't able to obtain that data. Maybe you had to obtain the data from some other organization. That would be a big change that you might want to discuss. So those would be maybe some things that you would consider including or focusing on if you are doing an analysis of secondary data. Otherwise, the sections should be pretty similar to if you're conducting a study with primary data. The question is, what if the results in the discussion are all in one chapter? How we know that all our independent and dependent variables are completely discussed. So again, if you are writing a paper where they require you to put the results in the discussion all in one chapter, you just want to make sure you follow your school's guidelines as closely as possible in terms of where the information should go and what the specific sections should be, because it really doesn't change the ultimately the information that you're going to have in your paper, because your paper is going to have information about the results of your statistical tests, and it's also going to have a discussion portion. Whether typically those things go into two separate chapters, but if you're working in a format where they want you to discuss those or incorporate those all into one chapter, it's just a matter of how the information is organized and where you're presenting it. So I know there are some schools that might have a section in the results chapter called evaluation of findings, which asks you to give a short interpretation of the results that's usually found in the discussion chapter. But it just really comes down to following your specific school's guidelines or template as closely as possible. And it may also be useful for you to find an example completed paper from a student who has recently completed the program, or your specific degree program or your specific school. So you can get some ideas about how these students who have already graduated, how they set up their chapters and the information if you have to incorporate both the results and the discussion in the same chapter. We have a question, is there a problem if the results are not statistically significant? The answer is no, it's not a problem if the results are not statistically significant. A lot of students will think that, if they run their analyses and nothing is significant, then their study failed in some way, or they're gonna face problems from their committee or something like that. But that's not really the case. It just means you're taking a different approach to your discussion if your results are significant versus if your results are not significant. And we do have other webinars that focus more on the discussion chapter. So that may be able to provide you some more information about what to do if your results aren't significant. But basically, you would discuss how your results are different from what you expected, how it's different from what was found in previous research, and that may open up for discussion for avenues for future research to determine, why are we getting these mixed results? What more research needs to be done in order to get a clearer picture of what's going on with these specific questions. Another question, is it necessary to include the normality chart to the result or just mention that? Normally, if you are doing some kind of a visual test of an assumption, like a histogram or a chart to test for normality, you want to include that chart so that your reader can see what you are looking at, and they can see how you made the determination that the data were normal or not normal. But it also depends on kind of the flow of your chapter, the amount of results or analyses that you're doing, because if you're running a lot of different tests and you had to test normality for each one, it may not make a lot of sense to put in a chart for each normality test, because it could really break up the flow of your chapter. If you're doing like 20 different t-tests, maybe you don't want a histogram for every single one of those. If you need to report all those histograms, maybe put those in an appendix, and then in the results chapter itself, you just do a description summarizing what the results of those histograms were. So again, it kind of depends on again, going back to the requirements of your school, the specific analyses that you're doing, how many analyses that you're doing. Like I said, if you're doing a lot of analyses, having a chart for every single one may be a little bit cumbersome to work from. So it can depend on those factors. And question, how many literature is scientifically needed for a specific variable? I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you're talking about using literature to justify the choosing certain variables for your results, that's more of an issue for kind of the background parts of your study, like the introduction or the literature review. And we do have webinars that cover those sections of the dissertation. So if you're interested in finding out more information about how you pick certain variables to examine in your study, how you justify picking variables and setting up your study, we do have other webinars that cover the other sections of the dissertation that look at those issues in more depth. Okay, and it looks like those are all the questions that are currently open. So if you do have any other questions, feel free to type those in now. And I'll just wait another minute or two to see if anyone else has any additional questions. In the meantime, because I think someone did ask about what other services we provide, again, you can look at the information that we have on the screen here. To contact us if you're interested in more additional services. You can discuss what you need, and we can tell you about the types of services that we provide. And as another note, because someone did ask about the recording of the presentation will be available. And I think that's just been posted as well. So yeah, you can definitely go back and access the recording of the presentation, and also look at our webinar archive to look at recordings for other webinars and look at what other webinars we offer. All right, so it looks like that's all the questions that have been posted. So I'm going to go ahead and end the session for today. So I hope everyone found this session helpful. And again, we do offer webinars in other topics as well. So you can check out what other webinars we offer. And again, contact us using the information here if you're interested in more one-on-one support. But thanks everyone for attending the webinar today, and I hope everyone has a great day.